I'd like to welcome Dr. Monica Barratt. Dr. Monica Barratt is a social scientist for the Drug Policy Modelling Program, part of Australia's National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. And her work is funded by, via the National Health and Medical Research Council. I've known Monica for about 10 years now, and over the last 15 years, Monica's research has examined the social and public health implications of digital technologies for people who use illicit and emerging psychoactive drugs. Research topics emerging from this interest include online drug markets or crypto markets, and policy responses to novel psychoactive substances. So Monica's had a broad range of research in, especially in the sort of online space in the drug world, but is also an academic in the drug world, and that can be a difficult road to tread sometimes. Monica, welcome.
Thanks, Nick. It's nice to be here. And yeah, I think we have known each other for about 10 years from memory. I'm now working at RMIT, but I've still got those connections to the Drug Policy Modelling Program.
I've grabbed an old bio. I'm sorry.
Where do we want to start? That's okay.
Maybe let's start first with you have published a paper relatively recently. Look, 2020 just feels like it went by like that, but also took forever. Coming out, Stigma, Reflexivity, and the Drug Researchers' Drug Use. And this is a paper about talking about one's own drug use in the academic community. It's an issue that's come up a bit, especially in terms of psychedelic research, with people asking questions of whether or not clinicians or people that are treating people with psychedelics should have that primary experience. And there's a bit of debate about that. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on your paper.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the paper we brought out, which I think you've linked in your Twitter and the chat, it's an open access paper, so feel free to check it out, anyone that's interested. But essentially, it grew out of, it was a long time coming, this paper, because I think for me, it's been now 10 years since I published my PhD. And when I was writing my PhD, which was about online drug discussion and I guess what people who use drugs were gaining from and how are they being affected by digital technologies in the 2000s. So it was sort of a different set of digital technologies to perhaps what we see today. But that topic came completely out of my own experience. I mean, that's why I was doing it. I noticed way back in my early 20s when I was using drug forums and nobody else was talking about them, and that they were a big issue for me, that I could, find out information, I could meet people, there was community, all this stuff. And this made a big difference to what was going on for me. I felt like in a positive way, access to that kind of, community and information. So I wanted to do my thesis on that, went ahead and did all of that. And, it was informed by theory, but it was also informed by experience. And so I wrote a few thousand words that I was going to include in my thesis that described, I guess, my relationship to the topic, with some experiential discussion in there, some self-disclosure. And I was heavily advised to remove that section 10 years ago, I guess at that point in my career. So I did, but I kept all the writings and the thinking kept going. And then about 5 years ago, at a conference, a drugs conference, a Scottish PhD student I'd never met before, Anna Ross, got up on stage and basically disclosed her own drug use, talked about her role as a consumer as well as a researcher in policy discussions. And in Scotland, she was actually involved in some of these policy roundtables with sort of multiple hats on as a researcher, but then she would pipe up quite often and talk about, well, actually, this is what it's like, for example, to use heroin, or this is what it's like, for example, to be part of the rave scene for a few years and take stimulant drugs. So she talked about that. And that got everybody talking, professors through to students, everybody got talking at that conference about, well, should we, shouldn't we, what should we say, what if we haven't, what if we have, how does that work, what does that mean for knowledge production, what does that mean for science, what does that mean for reputation, what does it mean for policy change? So that sort of started this discussion, which turned into this paper, which sort of evolved over time. And because there are 4 of us on this paper, we didn't feel like it was appropriate to talk about our own stuff, our own potential disclosures. So the paper is more putting, I guess, a framework around the things you might need to consider if you're looking at this issue. I guess that's what you would call it. And since then, there's been quite a lot of publications in the research world, not just in the psychedelics, but in the sort of people who research illegal drugs world. In fact, there's a special issue that's starting to come out paper by paper in the International Journal of Drug Policy. So one of the titles of one of the papers that came out is called "The Missing I," as in capital I, in Drug Research and the Epistemic Justice of Disclosure. And it's a fascinating essay where the professor who wrote it, Ingrid Walker, who's also known as a bad academic on Twitter, which is such an excellent Twitter handle. So she discloses and she writes about that and weaves it into her discussion about how that has affected her work, how it's been integral to her work around the injustice of drug policy in the United States, which, she's written books about. So, I mean, it's been amazing to read that sort of thing. At the same time, as you mentioned, there's been this debate in the psychedelic world about, is it even possible to, say, for example, be a psychedelic therapist if you haven't done that yourself? What happens if you disclose in academic articles? What happens if you don't disclose? And I don't know if we've really come to any hard decisions about this sort of thing at the moment.
On Monday, I was part of Yarra Drug and Health Forum monthly meeting where Dr. Neil Coventry, the chief psychiatrist, was talking about the recent Royal Commission into mental health. And it seems the buzzy word at the moment in the mental health area is lived experience. And that term, I think, comes largely from the alcohol and other drugs world. It seems like things have changed over the past 10 years. Do you think that now people that are working, people who are bureaucrats, people who are academics, people who are experts, are becoming more accepting of understanding that somebody's experience can be something that's useful for their ability to engage in a topic?
I think it depends on the story that they're telling, whether the narrative that you're telling fits with something that can be, like, just for example, Anna Ross, who we wrote this article with, she's written a chapter called "The Happy Drug User," all right, and basically saying if that's your story, happy, enjoying your life, also using drugs, also doing maybe these other things like research or whatever, policy making, whatever it is that you're doing, that story is a little bit harder for people to handle. The redemption story, where maybe you've had problematic drug use in the past, you've gone and had treatment, now you're, so-called clean, that story is much more acceptable, palatable for people to handle. So I think there's not yet enough space, and I mean, I would love there to be more space for multiple narratives of current, past, whatever drug use of all kinds. So, I mean, in our paper, we sort of talk about, I guess, how different kinds of drugs, what types, what type of use, whether it's current, ongoing, past, treated or not, that matters as well. And also, of course, where you're currently positioned in terms of your existing privilege vis-a-vis your gender, your ethnicity, all this other stuff intersects with your capacity to potentially then disclose this part of who you are. So, for example, if you're a parent, and there's potential there that you could be seen as neglectful simply through a stereotype that could have repercussions for you and your family and your children. So these sorts of issues affect different people differently. So yeah, I mean, I would like to think that things are changing, and I mean, there's a campaign back, I think it's February 20. It's happened a couple of years in a row, called Thank You Plant Medicine, and interestingly, they've focused on the plant medicine, and I know that's relevant to the discussions we're having today. But there's also this issue around psychedelic exceptionalism. What if someone has used heroin and cocaine and they're not in the psychedelics and they're not in the cannabis world? Are they still able to talk about that, or will they then be stigmatized? Whereas perhaps if it's psychedelics or cannabis, we're a bit less concerned now. That's another concern, I guess, that could be going on at the moment. It depends on what drug we're talking about.
Yeah, it does often feel like there's I've lost my words. It's more of a branding issue for a lot of people than it is about what's actually happening and what the realities of somebody's life is. So many drug discussions that I see online, people want to, rather than talk about something different, they just want to reframe the same thing in their own terms, use terms like medicine rather than drug. People don't like that word drug. It is a stigmatized word, so they move away from it and move towards other words. But do you think, does that have a negative effect? Is it just the natural thing that happens as we move towards rebranding? What do you think of this sort of language malarkey?
It's hard because, the word drug has a lot of stigma attached to it, and it also is quite culturally different. I mean, the fact that in the States you have a drugstore, and when I hear that, phrase drugstore, I find it quite bizarre, but that's just their pharmacy. It is that these words do have different meanings even across countries. And yeah, I mean, psychoactive substances, I think, is a good kind of catch-all to bring everything in and not necessarily have that drug connotation, but still not exceptionalise particular substances. What's that?
Except then the government goes and bans them all if it's psychoactive.
Yeah, but we can't really get away from that. I mean, all the things we're talking about today are psychoactive. That psychoactive capacity is something we can't get away from, whether they be plants or made in a laboratory. And I guess I get a little bit frustrated at the idea that anything that's so-called natural is always better or more healthy or the right way to go as compared to something that is so-called synthetic. It feels a bit romanticized to me, but, I also appreciate the idea of being able to grow your own. And you can't do that with a synthetic, totally chemistry type chemical. So, I think all of that is worth talking about. But in terms of stigma, why is it that we would stigmatize people who go for certain kinds of drugs more than others? That's a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. I'm just watching, there's a little bit of commentary going on in the YouTube comments. Do feel free to drop any comments or questions that you have. Kelsey just noting that sobriety or use should be talked about more because it is so specific to the person, especially in scientific work and when making policies surrounding drug use. Which is a good point. It was something that I touched on at the very start of the day, back at 1 o'clock, hours ago, talking about rather than seeing mushrooms as something dangerous. Yes, I see you, Kane. Rather than seeing mushrooms as something dangerous, seeing it as something that we need to respect, which means that we understand the danger, but there's also potential in these things. The respectful relationship is more, I think, complicated, where we're actually trying to understand something rather than just say no, for example. More comments. Hey Dimu podcast is just saying that she's really enjoying this discussion and that it is a really important discussion. A few people talking about it being an important discussion. Martin Williams, exceptionalism often reflects something else going on as well. I mean, there's a lot of, I think I've been listening to a podcast called Conspirituality, which has been looking at the health and wellness scene, which does include psychedelics. Health and wellness psychedelics get wrapped up into the health and wellness scene, and all sorts of claims get made about what is possible. I mean, at the moment with psychedelic research and with articles coming out all the time about the potential for psychedelics to help with things like depression, you get this other effect where people who maybe aren't as scientifically literate then go and seek out things like mushrooms to try and self-heal themselves, which can end up doing completely the opposite thing. So I guess, is that maybe the danger that we're trying to avoid? Is that the pitfall, and why academia is cautious in this area?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like a couple of months ago, we did some global drug survey result sharing around this issue, where we asked in the global drug survey about whether people had self-medicated, so used psychedelic substances without having any professional oversight. Because obviously there are people, they're shamans or just a friend that's going to be there with them who has some professional oversight. But, and I think that's going to happen for as long as there isn't that availability of medicinal grade and, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, because there's so much hype, and also because a lot of people are suffering and they're having trouble finding mental health treatments that work for them. So, of course, they're going to look for other alternatives. So, yeah, I think it's tricky at the moment, because people are doing trials, and obviously we'll hear from PRISM more about where we're up to on that soon. And those medical trials kind of need to come to their conclusions before we can expect, for example, in Australia to have medical access. But even when we have medical access, we're still going to have people who want to take these substances outside of that medical frame. And I think it's problematic for, all the people involved in the medical area to just sort of ignore that. We shouldn't be ignoring that. We need to be aware of it and continue to support, I think, decriminalisation, essentially, and regulation.
The paper is coming out, Stigma, Reflexivity and the Drug Researchers' Drug Use. I've dropped it into the comments. I'll drop it in again. Monica, thanks for talking or touching on this topic. I feel like it's a topic that we would love to cover more from the Australian Psychedelic Society perspective, especially over the coming months. So thank you very much, Monica.
Well, thanks a lot, Nick.
If you want to follow along the conversation on other platforms, you can do so. Twitter, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, and we're on Facebook. Like us, follow us, tweet at us. Hashtag is MushroomDay21. And we are going to be hearing from our keynote speaker shortly. Before we do that, I just want to, since we've sort of touched on this a little bit, just want to direct you to some information that might be useful for you or somebody that you know. So DanceWise is a harm reduction service that operates at parties. It's not been a particularly party time lately, but providing information to people who go along to festivals and events. And some of the information that we have, you can see a variety of things here. So I work with Harm Reduction Victoria and with the DanceWise program. And these are some of the resources. And we've just got some basic information on psilocybin. You can find it at the website, hrvic.org.au/resources. It's just a handy trifold brochure with some really basic harm reduction tips, things to avoid, things that to watch out for, and those sorts of things. It's definitely a beginner's sort of guide, but might be useful for maybe somebody that you know or for yourself. So that's hrvic.org.au/resources.